All right, Avodah Zarah, Yud Bet. So we're going to be learning a Gemara that appears in a slightly different way in the Midrash Veikor Rabbah in Parshat Mitzorah, and we'll look at some Mefarshim in terms of how to understand one aspect of the Midrash. But really, what we're going to be focusing most of our time on is on this long Perush of the Kli Yakar, where he takes these two versions of this Midrash, the one in our Gemara and the one in the Veikor Rabbah, and he quite brilliantly, I think, tries to understand why they're not the same Midrash with two variant versions, but actually saying two different things, and how the nuances between them actually are quite relevant to how you can understand what they're both trying to teach. So we'll see how he explains all of that as we go. So, first version is our Gemara in Avodah Zarah Daf Yud Tet Amud Bet. So, the Gemara says as follows: Machriz Rabbi Alexandri. So, Rabbi Alexandri used to announce or pronounce, Man ba'echai, man ba'echai. Who wants life? So you'd kind of go around the streets and say, who wants life? Who wants to live? Okay, kanuf ve'atu kule alma legabe. So then everybody would come gather around him, because he's going around saying, who wants to live? So naturally that garners interest and people come to him. Amrilei havlan chaye. So they say to him, give us life. So Amar lehu, he says to them, Mi ha'ish hachafetz chayim, yirat Hashem ala melchem, netzor lashoncha meira, usfatecha midah mirma, su meira v'aseh tov bakesh shalom v'alfeo. Right? We're all familiar with this from Sukkot de Zimra on Shabbat. Who is the person that wants life, desires life? So that person should guard his tongue from speaking evil. He should turn away from evil and do good. So then Rabbi Alexandri darshans and says, Shema Yomar Nitzarti l'shonim mira usfatay medaber mirma elech ve'edgare b'sheina. So lest you say, okay, in order to stop my tongue from speaking evil and my lips from speaking deceit, I'll go sleep all the time. And then I won't be speaking Lashon Hara because I'll be sleeping. Talmud Lomar Sumera V'aseh Tov. Right? So it's not just turn away from bad, but it also means to actively do good. Ve'en Tov Ela Torah, and there's no good except Torah. Shneimar Ki lekach tov natati lachem torati al ta'azovu. In other words, you need to not just go to sleep in order to stop Lashon Hara, but you need to actively engage in Torah, and then through that you will also guard your tongue from speaking evil, and you will avoid saying Lashon Hara.
So that word etgareh, what does that mean?
Good question. Let's see. I have it pulled up here.
I know what it means in modern Hebrew, more or less, but what does it mean here?
Indulge.
Indulge. Interesting. Never saw that before. In modern Hebrew, lidgarot is like to provoke somebody, but that might be a completely different story.
It would seem that way, yeah. That doesn't really make sense here. It seems right. I guess indulge is how the translation says it. Yeah. Good question. So that's one version of the Midrash. Okay. The second version is in, as we said, Veikor Rabbah, Tet Zayin Bet. Okay, so there the Midrash says, Zot tiyeh Torat HaMitzorah. So the opening of Parshat Mitzorah is about the whole purification ceremony. A person has to take two birds, and then there's a whole thing where he slaughters one of them, and basically he does this whole thing, and then he becomes purified eventually from his tzarat. So Hadu Dichtiv, this is as it says, Mi ha'ish hachavetz chayim. Ma'aseh berochel echad shaya machazir ba'arayot shayu smuchot letzipori. So it's a story of a merchant who would take his wares and he would travel around the cities or the areas that were close to Tzipori, which is up in the Galil, if I'm not mistaken. And he would pronounce and say, Man bai limizban sam chaim. So he would say, who wants to buy the medicine of life, or the spice of life? Odkin alein. People would take interest in him, and they would kind of look after and see what he was saying. Rabbi Yanai havayativ upashet beturkiline. Rabbi Yanai was sitting, and he was learning Pshat. He was learning Torah. In his turklin is like chaklin, which is kind of his salon or his common area. He was in his house, up in the upper area. Sham Ed Machriz Man Bai Sam Chaim, and he heard this merchant going around saying, who wants to buy the medicine of life? Amar le, so he called down to the merchant and he said, Sak lehacha zabinli. So he said, come up to me and then I'll buy it from you. Rabbi Yanai says to the merchant, come upstairs and then sell it to me. Amar le, so the merchant says to him, Lav ant tzarich le velo dichvatach. So the merchant says, you don't need this medicine and neither do the people like you. Atrach ale, but Rabbi Yanai insisted, Salik legabe. So the merchant went up to his house, Votzilo sefer Tehillim, and he took out a sefer Tehillim, Her'alo pasuk meish chafetz chaim. Similar to what Rabbi Alexandre says, that the medicine is these psukim, or the message contained within these psukim, right? Guard your tongue from evil, turn away from evil, and do good. Amar Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai in response says, Af Shlomo machriz ve'omer. It says in Mishlei, Shomer pivu l'shono, shomer mitzarot nafsho. So a similar idea, that someone who guards his mouth and his tongue, he guards himself from tzaras. Amar Rabbi Yanai, Kol yamai הייתי קורא הפסוק הזה, ולא הייתי יודע היכן הוא פשוט, עד שבא רוכל זה והודיעו. So Rabbi Yanai says, I've read this pasuk my whole life, I've never really understood either how simple it is or how it should be interpreted, until this merchant came and explained it to me. Right? Mi ha'isha chafetz chayin. This is the pasuk. Lefichach Moshe mazhir et Yisrael ve'omer lehem, zot tieh Torat ha'metzorah, Torat ha'motzi shem ra. Right? The famous drasha is, what is a metzorah? Metzorah is like a rashi tevot for motzi shem ra, someone who speaks lashon hara, and then the metzorah is, so you get sarat for saying lashon hara. And so, Torat HaMetzorah, meaning how do you purify yourself from Tzarat? So it's like the Torah of the Motzi Shemra. And the connection is this drasha of Rabbi Yanai where he says, Shomer piv u'leshono, Shomer mitzarot nafsho. So someone who guards his tongue, Shomer mitzarot nafsho, you can read it from mitzarat nafsho. He guards himself from Tzarat. Because Tzarat is a direct result of speaking Lashon Hara. So someone who guards himself from Lashon Hara guards himself from his soul or his body from Tzarat. So Adkan, the version in Vayikra Rabbah. So before we continue, like what are the differences? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So do you happen to know of any other discussions anywhere else where it comes up that maybe there's someone with tzara who's a real tzaddik, and maybe that's not the right explanation? Does anybody ever challenge that assumption?
That's well, there's lots of reasons given for why people.
Primitive logic of tzaddik v'tov lo rashav, right?
There's more than one reason given for tzarat. We'll actually see that in the Kli Yakar. The most famous one's probably this one, right? Motzi Shemra. But there are definitely stories of mitzoraim who are righteous. Probably the one that comes to mind is in Melachim Bet, where there's the story of 4 mitzoraim who are sitting outside of a city, and then, right, they go and they say, we may as well go into the enemy camp because we're going to die anyway from starvation. And then God caused a miracle where the enemy camp, he caused all the noise. It was Aram, I think, right? God caused all this noise, and so these Mitzorim go into the enemy camp and they see that it's empty, and then they report back to the Jewish king, and they are kind of the ones who lead the Yeshua for all of Malchut Yisrael in that story. But yeah, I think generally tzarat is considered something that's a negative thing. So I don't know. Do you have an example meaning? Do you have an example? I don't know of a specific example of someone who gets tzarat even though he's righteous.
But it's more that it's based on this simplistic calculus that tzaddik v'tovlo and ba'efech, right? So it's a very thin ice when you make that assumption that someone has tzarat, it's because he did something bad. Because then there's so many cases of righteous people suffering from this, that, or the other, but it's tzarat or something else. So it's a problematic position to work from, and obviously Sefer Iyov is entirely devoted to trying to challenge that position.
Yeah, I don't want to go into that right now. I think that's beyond the scope of this.
No, just was wondering if there was some dissenting opinion about tzarat specifically.
Got it. Okay. I don't know of one. I do know that there's other reasons given for it, other than Lashon Hara. There's like arrogance, and I think we'll see it in the Kli Yakar. Also, financial greed. We'll see it. Okay. So, just a couple of points on the specific story before going into the comparison between the two versions of the Midrashim. So one thing we saw was, like, a person shouldn't think to himself, I'll go indulge in sleep, right? So what kind of thought process is that? So the Maharsha says, mitam de kamar, for the reason that's given, that it's this kind of passive way of not violating Lashon Hara. If I'm not awake, I can't possibly say something negative about somebody else. Talmud lomar v'aseh tov. Right? Ki eskecha b'torah tishmor otcha shelo tavo lidei Lashon Hara. So he spells out explicitly kind of what the Gemara is obviously saying, which is that if you're speaking Torah and dealing in Torah, then that will guard you from speaking Lashon Hara. You don't have to be afraid to not speak at all, even though Lashon Hara is obviously a very serious thing, but you just need to make sure that you surround yourself with and you're constantly engaged in speech that is permitted and holy, and then you won't fall prey to Lashon Hara. We'll see this actually in a bit, but there's a pasuk in Mishlei which says that a healing tongue is the tree of life. And that's why it says there's nothing good other than Torah. Right, to deal with it. What does that mean? In other words, the idea being that if you're speaking words of Torah, that itself acts as kind of this healing or this preventative medicine against speaking Lashon Hara, and so you should do that, and you don't have to you don't have to fall back into sleeping in order to prevent yourself from saying Lashon Hara. The Eitz Yosef says it a bit more explicitly, where he says, "Rotze lomar shomar adam me'achar shetzarich lizaher kol kach b'shmirat halashon ki sakanat meruba." That since a person has to be very, very careful with the laws of shmirat halashon and guarding their tongue because it's very dangerous, in two senses. One is that it's a very severe sin and that the consequences are very serious, and there's tons of midrashim about that. But also in the sense that sakanata meruba, I think you can also understand it to mean that it's very easy it's very simple to violate it. It's a very easy thing to fall prey to, right? As opposed to murder, which is a very serious sin, but it's not something that is common. But Lashon Hara is extremely common, so it's very dangerous because it's so serious, but it's also so easy. So im ken tov lasum lepiv machsom shelo ledaber klal, kmo she'amar Hatana, v'lo matzati leguf tov mishtika. Right. So in Pirkei Avot, right, there's Rabbi Shimon ben Rav Gamliel. I think he says I grew up in the house of the Nasi, and I learned there's nothing better than being silent. Right. So there, the context is in the sense of you can absorb the words of the people around you. Sometimes silence is good, so that you're listening versus always trying to insert your own opinion. But here the Eitz Yosef is taking it to mean that in general you might say that it's good to be silent, right? Emor ma'at v'aser harbe. Why emor ma'at? Because if you say a lot, then you're going to violate the laws of saying bad things because it's so common and so easy to do. So best for you to put a muzzle over your mouth, as the Eitz Yosef says, and just not to say anything. And there's actually this concept in a lot of, right? I don't know how widely accepted it is, but there are people who on like Tisha B'Av or on Yom Kippur, they take a vow of silence, right? It's kind of one of these minhagim. The idea is, on Yom Kippur, I don't want to say anything other than the tefillot, of course, because there's very little good that can come of it, but I can definitely sin, and at least on Yom Kippur, I want to avoid that. So it's just saying you might have that thought process all the time, that I shouldn't say anything, because otherwise I'm going to be constantly engaged in sinful activity and bad-mouthing other people, etc. Amar shezeh ta'ut, right? And that's why the teaching here of Rabbi Alexander is that that's a mistake. Shebe'achrach tzarich lehatir leshono ledibur hiturai, right? That you should allow your mouth to say permitted things, which is Torah and things that are not Lashon Hara. So that's just kind of a point to just really flesh out the idea behind the Edgarei B'Sheina and what this teaching of Rabbi Alexander is actually saying. Okay. Before we learn the Kli Yakar, we need just to learn one Gemara of context in it beforehand. The Gemara in Erchin and Daf Tet Vav Amud Bet. So the whole Erchin, the Tet Vav, Tet Zayin, it's a whole bunch of Gemarot that deal with Lashon Hara. Like that's the place in Shas that is most concentrated midrashim and ideas around Lashon Hara. So it says, amongst those other Agadot, it says as follows: Amar Rabbi Chama bar Rabbi Chanina, Ma takanato shel mesaper Lashon Hara. So what is the fix, the tikkun for people who say Lashon Hara? Im Talmid Chacham hu yasok b'Torah. So if he's a Talmid Chacham, let him go learn. Right? Shneimar, mesaper Lashon Eitz Chaim. Right? This is what the Maharsha quoted. That Eitz Chaim ve'ein Lashon ela Lashon Hara. When it says Lashon, right, that which heals the tongue. So the reference there is Lashon Hara. Shneimar Chetz Shachut Lashonam. Because the tongue is this like arrow. It's a connotation of something that's bad and sharp in Lashon Hara. Then Eitz El Torah, Shneimar Eitz Chaim Hin Machazikim Ba. Right, and there's no tree except for the Torah. Obviously, Eitz Chaim Hin Machazikim Ba. So we say, Marpeh Lashon, that which heals the tongue from Lashon Hara, is the Torah. Very nice. V'ima Ma'aretzu Yashpil Dato. Right, so if you can't learn Torah, he's just a regular person. So how does he fix having said Lashon Hara? He should humble himself. Shneimar V'selef Ba Shever Ruach. Okay. Rabbi Acha Rabbi Chanina Omer, Siper en lo takana, שכבר קראתו דוד ברוח הקודש, שנאמר יקראת השם כל שפתי חלקות לשון מדברת. So someone who said Lashon Hara, there is no takana. There's no going back. You cannot do tshuva for it and fix it. Because David, and we know this because David HaMelech already put that person in karet. With Ruach HaKodesh, right? He says God should cut off anybody who speaks this way. All right, once you've said Lashon Hara, and we'll see the Kli Yakar discussing why, there's no going back. So what do you mean, Ma takanato shemesaper Lashon Hara? There is no such thing as a tikkun for someone who says Lashon Hara. So rather, that wasn't the teaching. The teaching was a little different. Ela ma takanato shelo yavo lidei Lashon Hara. Right? What is the best way to avoid ever getting into a situation where you're saying Lashon Hara? Im Talmid Chacham hu yasok b'Torah. If he's Talmid Chacham b'Torah, v'im ha'aretz hu yashpil dato shneimar v'selef b'shev ruach. And if he's just a regular person, he should humble himself. So there's a slight machloket here between what the teaching actually was. Is it about how you can fix having said Lashon Hara and kind of reverse it, or do some sort of tikkun or tshuva? Or is it a preventative methodology to never getting into that place in the first place? So with that context, yeah. Sorry,
I assume that like murder would be a category where there's no tshuva for that. Are there other categories? This is kind of unusual, right? That there's a sin that there is no tshuva for it. Is that of other examples, other categories?
I think for murder there is a tshuva. It's death.
Really?
I mean, yeah, death.
Okay.
Mita mechaperet. And also for Lashon Hara, I think also mita mechaperet. Although I do remember, I think there may be midrashim that say for Lashon Hara even death does not atone. That's how bad it is. It could be that it says that. But as a general rule, are there specific sins that there's no such thing as a tikkun for them? I don't have a good answer for that.
It just kind of struck me that wow, anybody could, have a moment of bad judgment and say something, and then that's it. End of story. There's no, ask for forgiveness of the person, do something good, whatever. It just seems kind of hard.
So, yeah, no, it's good. It's a good question. So, two things. One is that in this series of Gemarot in Erchin, it says extremely, extremely harsh things about Lashon Hara. Like, it outweighs Shfichut Damim Gilui Arayot, and the people who do it, it has very, very harsh words to the point where it's considered, the Midrashim very, very much make the point that it's something that is absolutely terrible. One of the, if not the worst sins that a person can commit, and they emphasize that point very strongly. So the fact that this is the one that perhaps is the hardest to come back from is it fits with the larger theme of this series of Gemarot that this is embedded within. But I think maybe the way to understand this is a little bit different, a bit more technically. That it's not that there's no tikkun in the spiritual sense of doing tshuva, but that practically there's no tikkun. And this is what the Kli Yakar is going to say. We'll see it inside, right? Because murder, there's also no tikkun. So that's a good example, because you can't bring, once you've murdered someone, you've murdered them. But if I steal from somebody, right, so I can return the item. Or if I hit someone, I can pay for the medical repair. Right? There's ways to do a tikkun for other sins. But Lashon Hara, once I've said something negative about somebody, that festers, it grows, it's parasitic, it's something that you can never retract the damage that has done to a person's reputation and to yourself as a person, in the sense that you are now like a gossiper who says these types of things. We'll see the Kli Yakar, he says it quite beautifully, but in that sense there's no tikkun. That Lashon Hara is such it has a life of its own. It's a virus, right? That when you say things about people, it spreads, gossip mill, and then you lose control over it. It goes to, and it gets to, and then it also, right, it becomes even more and more extreme. You may say something very small, and then it gets blown out of proportion, and I mean, we're all familiar. So in that sense, it has no tikkun because it's so dangerous. That's sakanata meruba, to quote Eitz Yosef. So maybe that's what it means, that there's no tikkun versus the spiritual sense. But
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Yeah, but it's a good point. I think you could probably interpret it either way. The Kli Yakar definitely reads it the way that I just explained now, but I think you could. There's also room to say it the first way, that it's the sort of sin that is so dire and so terrible that there may be no redemption for it. And in the sense, again, of Chazal really trying to make the point of how serious it is, right? I don't know how literally it's meant to be taken, if that's the intent, but more just to really scare, to get people scared of doing it, which is the point. Okay, the Kli Yakar. So he says, we only have 5 minutes left, but it's a bit long, but it's worth it. Okay, so he says this follows, right? He says, Ikar Tzarat, he's commenting on the beginning of Parshat Mitzorah, which is where the Midrash version of this teaching, of the story was. Ikar Tzarat Baal Gimel Averot, Remuzim Parasha. So Tzarat comes for three, according to Kli Yakar, for three different types of sins. In Lashon Hara, V'gasut Ruach, V'chemdat HaMamon. Lashon Hara, most famously, but also arrogance and greed. And since there's two birds that are part of the atonement process for Tzarat, they come to atone for three things. So Lashon Hara, Osin Ma'aseh Patit. Right, that the Gemara says birds, they chatter, right? They chirp, they tweet, and not in the modern sense, but they right. Birds are a good symbol of the type of animal for Lashon Hara, right? They're always chattering, so you need to use birds as part of your atonement, or to kill the birds as part of the atonement, to silence the Lashon Hara. Right, and it's also an atonement for arrogance, because arrogance is like it's a lofty, and it's when you rise up. So just like birds, which are high up. There's a pasuk in Mishlei which talks about greed and compares it to birds that are in the sky. Okay, very nice. And the Kli Yakar says, since most mefarshim in their commentaries on Parshat Mitzorah go on and wax on about Lashon Hara, since this is what Mitzorah is ostensibly about, I will also go on about it. So the first pronouncement about Lashon Hara is the version with the merchant and Rabbi Yanai in his salon. The second pronouncement is the one of Rabbi Alexander in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. And I skipped a lot here because he goes on and on. But basically, he starts by asking, being very specific on the differences between the two stories. And he says we can be very medakdek on the differences between the stories. And so I brought a couple here. So he says, so the merchant is introduced as he was traveling around the cities that were in the area of Tzipori. Why? So the Kli Yakar asks, why do I care about that? Gam yesh הרבה שינויים בין הכרזת הרוכל ובין הכרזת רבי אלכסנדרי. Their actual pronouncements were different. כי הרוכל הכריז man ba'e lemizban sam chaim. The merchant said, who wants to buy the medicine of life? Right, he's kirli mizban. Right? He mentions the idea of buying, right, as a purchase, because he's a merchant. Rabbi Alexandri achriz man ba'echai. Lo is kirli mizban. Right, and Rabbi Alexandri just said, who wants life, or who wants to live. He doesn't talk about buying anything. He doesn't talk about medicine. He just says, who wants life. So what's the difference? And he goes on and lists a whole bunch of other differences. Mikol makom kasher hayal lavin kol zeh ma achrazat Rabbi Alexandri. He says these, right? It's difficult to understand the differences between these two stories. So then the Kli Yakar says, instead of just saying it's two slightly different variants of the same kernel midrash, he says no. How to resolve all these different contradictions. And this is the Gemara we learned about Rabbi Chama saying that there is a tikkun for Lashon Hara, learning Torah or humbling oneself, and Rabbi Acha saying, no, the teaching was that there's no tikkun for Lashon Hara, but rather it's preventative how to never get there in the first place. And so the Kli Yakar says, Rabbi Acha says that there's no tikkun for Lashon Hara. So he says that it seems for Rabbi Acha that it makes sense. This is what we were saying before. That he's already, if someone said Lashon Hara and he's put a blemish in holy ones and he's said gossip and that the voice has gone out into the whole world, of course there's no way to fix it, right? Right? It doesn't matter how many rams he brings in sacrifice and atonement, he'll never be able to undo the wicked thoughts that he had or the things that he said. Right? If he goes from one end of the heavens to the other, just announcing to the whole world, I lied, I said lies, what I said before wasn't true. Kiminhag dorenu, this is the Kli Yakar talking now. Like in our generation, if someone says, if one of these gossipers says something negative about somebody honorable or respectable, see how quickly it goes from east to west, right? How quickly gossip spreads like a fire. He can't fix what he's bent, right? What's bent, you can't take it back. Lashon Hara. Once it's out there, it's out there. So that's what it means. Ein lo takana. Al korach dinu shekashem she'en takana lezeh shesiper alav kach en takana lesapro. So just like the person whose reputation has been irreparably damaged, irreversibly damaged, there's no fixing. So too for the gossiper, there's no fixing. He can't undo what he's done. And so that's how the Kli Yakar understands Rabbi Acha's opinion. And he says, Aval Rabbi Chama Savar, the first opinion, who said there is a tikkun for Lashon Hara, mitekama merapeh, right? Rabbi Chama quotes a pasuk, Marpeh Lashon Etz Chaim, that which heals Lashon Hara is Torah. So from the fact that it says there is a healing, right? Merapeh, ein refuah elim ken b'makom choli, right? When you talk about healing, that means that there has to be some kind of illness. So he says that it must mean that there is a healing for Lashon Hara, which is in contrast to what Rabbi Acha held. So that is how he explains the machloket between Rabbi Acha and Rabbi Chama. And then the Kli Yakar's big chidush is as follows. He says, V'ine Rabbi Alexandri sover gam hu siper en lo takana. The difference between the two versions of our Gemara is our Gemara in Avodah Zarah with Rabbi Alexandri, he holds like the opinion of Rabbi Acha, who says that there is no tikkun for Lashon Hara because it's out there, it's spread, there's no fixing it. Rabbi Alexandri would only go to the people that had not yet said Lashon Hara, and his goal was to warn people and to teach people how to guard their health, their spiritual health, that they shouldn't fall prey to Lashon Hara. He'd go around and he'd say, who wants life, who wants life? to people who hadn't said Lashon Hara, who weren't gossipers. Lo izkir Lashon Sam, and he didn't use the language medicine. Right, v'gam lo izkir Lashon Lemizban, and he didn't use the language of buying something. Lefi sheshmirat habriyut eno tzarich Sam. Right, it's preventative. Right, you don't have this idea of medicine because you're not taking medicine for an illness. These are people who aren't sick yet. He's doing it preventatively, right? It's like getting a shot almost. He's saying, I'm not giving you medicine for your sickness. I want to give you an immunity to the sickness. And so there's no concept of saying, I want to sell you a medicine. It doesn't apply, right? Right? He's like a doctor who's just teaching someone something effective. Right? Socially distance, wear a mask. That's Rabbi Alexandri's goal here. And so that's what he's trying to do by saying Nitzor Leshoncha Meira. Right? Aval mi shekvar nafal al hacholi, but someone who's already has the illness. Az hu tzarich lesamim uvavuram toveh harofeh scharo. Right? Such a person needs medicine, and that's when a doctor takes his fee. Right? Because he has to administer the medicines and he has to buy the medicines, so he has to take a fee for his services. He went to the people who hadn't yet said Lashon Hara to guard themselves. They shouldn't fall prey to the illness of Lashon Hara. He just says who wants life. Aval rochel zeh, but the variant version of the Midrash in Vayikra Rabbah, which talks about the merchant in Rabbi Yanai, Savar, he holds like the opinion in Erechin of Rabbi Chama, who says that a Mesaper Lashon Hara does have a tikkun. Such a person can, it's not irreversible. Afilu l'mi shekvar siper, but the merchant held even someone who said Lashon Hara can still do a tikkun. How did he know? Didn't we just say that someone who goes and spreads Lashon Hara, there's no fixing it? What do you mean that the merchant believed that you could fix it? He knew it from his own experience. Kigam, and here the Kli Yakar brilliantly says, what is Rochel? Rochel means a merchant, but it also means something else. Right? Lo telech rachil be'amecha in Kedoshim. Don't gossip. A Rochel is a gossiper, not just a merchant. So he says it's a deliberate choice of words, Rochel. Kigam hu haya Rochel, holech rachil, veragil al leshono l'shalech medanim ben achim. That this merchant, this gossiper, used to go and cause enmity between people. Then he wanted to do atonement. And he wanted to know how to fix his Lashon Hara. And then he went and he saw, okay, Talmidei Chachamim, they need to learn Torah. Right? And then he says that's why it matters that the merchant, the Rochel, was going around Sipori. So the Kli Yakar says it's not the merchant going around Sipori, it's the gossiper who is then coming to the Tziporim, the birds from the Midrash, the birds, the Shnei Tziporim that are the atonement for the Mitzorah. Right? Shaya mechazer b'tshuva otana ha'arayot ha'krovot l'ma'aseh tzipor ha'osin ma'aseh patit. Just like the Midrash said that the birds are the chatterers. So the gossiper is going around to the places of the birds. He's going to the chatterers to give them the lesson of how to atone for Lashon Hara. Because they're the ones, specifically the Kli Yakar says, that need it because the Rochel holds. Even the ones who've already gossiped can get the atonement. And that's why he says, who wants to purchase the medicine of life? They were like sick people. That's why the Rochel talks about buying a medicine, not like Rabbi Alexander, who just says who wants life. So the Kli Yakar takes the two versions of the Midrash, applies them to the two versions of the teaching of Rabbi Chanina and Erechin of saying, does someone who's already said Lashon Hara have a tikkun or not? And so then the Kli Yakar just finishes off and he says as follows, and this is a good kind of Musar Haskel to close. V'yatzati migidri. The Kli Yakar says, I have gone out from my normal way. Because the Kli Yakar generally his perush on Chumash is pshuto shel parasha. He goes, explains the psukim, but here he goes on a whole rant about Lashon Hara. So he says, I've gone on and on about it, which is not my normal way of doing things. Ya'an ki ra'iti dor ze parutz me'od me'od b'chet ha'lashon v'tzarat nosheneti. That the Kli Yakar says, my generation there is way too much lashon hara, and it is like a festering tzarat. כי גם בגלות מצרים היו בעבור שהיו בהם דל תורין, ונגאלו בזכות דל דברים, ואחד מהם בזכות שלא היה בהם לשון הרע. So even though in Mitzrayim there were some dal torin, which are people that say lashon hara, in the end, there's a midrash which teaches us that they were redeemed for 4 reasons, and one of the 4 was that they didn't have lashon hara that was prominent, and that was why they merited redemption in Egypt. V'bayit sheni chazru l'suram, as we all know, that there was a lot of sectarian disagreement in Bayit Sheni, a lot of sinat chinam, and so people went back to speaking lashon hara about one another. ועוד היום בגלות החל הזה חטא הלשון והולך וגדל עד עלות חמת השם לאין מרפא. And even today the Kli Yakar says in our galut, this sin is going and getting greater and greater and greater until it gets to the point where it will arouse God's anger and there is no lessening it. לכן ראיתי לדבר קצת בהתעוררות זה, לאמור אולי ישמעו ההורים שבמחנה העברים ויתנו על ליבם לתקן פרצה זו. So the Kli Yakar says, that's why I found it worthwhile to delve into this lashon hara through this beautiful drasha that he spells out between the 2 versions of the midrashim, tying them into the 2 opinions in the Gemara and Erechin, in order, hopefully, that it will get people to listen and people will take it to heart and internalize it and perhaps fix their ways. And then he kind of concludes that and ties it perhaps back into his whole point, which is that the Rochel, similar to Rabbi Chama, understand that even people who have said Lashon Hara have a tikkun. So the Kli Yakar seems to paskin at the end, indirectly, unlike Rabbi Acha, unlike Rabbi Alexandri, to say in my generation there's lots of people who are speaking Lashon Hara, but perhaps they can fix that if they take to heart the severity of the sin and they learn Torah, and that can be the Sam Chaim for these people.